Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Monday, February 28th, 2011 special joint meeting of the Glendale Transportation and Parking Commission and Glendale Planning Commission. May we have a roll call for the Transportation and Parking Commission?
Commissioner Fwad?
Here.
Commissioner Sahakian?
Here.
Commissioner Yakubian?
Here.
Commissioner Welch?
Here.
Chairperson Wiseman?
Here. And may we also have roll call for the Planning Commission?
Commissioner Landrigan?
Here.
Commissioner Lee? Commissioner Sheets?
Here.
Commissioner Yasayan?
Here.
Chairperson Kane?
Here. What is next, please?
Item 1A is flag salute. Chairperson Wiseman.
Please join me in saluting our country's flag. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And what is next, please?
Item 2 is posting of the agenda. The agenda for the Monday, February 28, 2011 special joint meeting of the Glendale Transportation and Parking Commission and Planning Commission was posted by Friday, February 25th, 2011 before 5:30 p.m. on the bulletin board outside of City Hall.
Thank you. I just want to take a brief moment to see if there is anyone in the audience who wishes to speak on any items that are not on the agenda tonight, since we do not have an item for oral communications. And seeing none, we'll skip that and proceed to the next item.
Item 3 is action item. At 3A is report regarding amendments to Title 30 of the Glendale Municipal Code 1995 to parking standards within the downtown specific plan area. At 3A1 is motion of the Planning Commission recommending to the City Council the implementation of certain amendments to the Glendale Municipal Code regarding parking standards in the downtown specific plan area. And item 3A2 is motion of the Transportation and Parking Commission recommending to the City Council the implementation of certain amendments to the Glendale Municipal Code regarding parking standards in the downtown specific plan area.
All right, thank you. And we'll bring up John O'Bagdanian for the staff report. Thank you.
adoption by late March of this year. With that, I will introduce Bonnie Nelson from Nelson Nygaard. She will give a brief presentation and overview of the policy concepts and the code amendments being proposed for your consideration tonight. At the conclusion of Bonnie Nelson's presentation, myself, staff from Redevelopment Planning and Traffic and Transportation, and Bonnie Nelson will be available to answer any questions that you might have on the proposed code amendments.
Thank you, Commissioners. I hope I don't sound like the Wizard of Oz here, which is sort of what Mike sounded like there. As Mike mentioned, this is my second visit to you on this topic. We were together in November and we discussed possible changes to parking requirements in Glendale as an opportunity to implement the DSP vision. What we're here to do tonight is to, and this is not going to work for me. See if I go here. Oh, okay. If I go here, try one more time. Nope. I'm going to have to just point at you. What we're doing tonight is trying to formalize this into new code language. The recommendations that I have for you tonight are a series of improvements that are all designed to work together. The overall goal is to provide the right amount of parking for the uses that are proposed in the DSP area without adding to an oversupply of parking downtown, and while also creating a walkable, livable downtown that we all envision as part of the DSP. These recommendations, I need to emphasize, are specific to the DSP area and do not apply to the city as a whole. The first recommendation is to adjust the minimum parking requirements. This is not, we are not proposing a complete overhaul or anything very dramatic, but some targeted adjustments that are designed to bring the city of Glendale in line with its peers and best practices. The targeted minimums are just that. They are minimum requirements. A developer could build parking over the minimum if they so desire. This is the minimum amount of parking that they may not go down below. And while the changes are recommended on only a handful of land uses in the DSP area, I want to assure you that we did look at all land uses and compare them against your peers, and as well as looking at actual parking demand versus what is recommended in the code. This table, which you have seen before, identifies the changes that we are recommending. One of the things I want to emphasize is that in most cases, what we are recommending would not reduce parking requirements below levels where exceptions have already been granted. One of the themes that you'll be hearing from me tonight is what we are trying to do is to develop a regularized process where we have more certainty for development, and in exchange for that, we have realistic parking codes, realistic parking demand, so the developers do not find themselves constantly going in front of council to ask for exceptions, which council routinely grants and gets nothing in return. So what we're trying to do is to maximize benefit for the city while providing realistic parking minimums for developers. We would raise the change of use exemption. Currently, the parking code says that any change of use over 2,000 square feet be brought to existing requirements. In consultation with business owners, particularly small businesses on Brand Boulevard, we are recommending that that be increased from 2,000 to 5,000 square feet. This would encourage redevelopment and lower the parking burden. It would allow a small business that's in one storefront to move and acquire the adjacent storefront, but we're talking about a maximum of 5,000 square feet, still a relatively small use, and would be relevant to those smaller storefronts, particularly on Brand and the surrounding streets. Larger uses like schools and that sort of thing would exceed the 5,000 square foot level and would not be affected by this provision. We are recommending that tandem and stacked parking be allowed to satisfy some parking requirements. In residential units, we are suggesting that there be no limit on the amount of tandem and stacked parking, provided that the shared parking is for the same unit, so that you be able to independently access parking spaces. Unless you have two parking spaces sharing for the same unit, then you would not require independent access. For non-residential, up to 50% of parking demand could be met in tandem and stacked parking arrangements, but only if a valet is provided to handle the parking. We are recommending the adoption of an in-lieu fee, and this is one where we are really capturing value for the city. It gives the developers an option to pay a fee in lieu of providing some portion of their parking spaces. Basically, the way it is today is developers go to council and ask for an exception. They're either granted it or they're not, and my experience is that they are granted it way more than they're not, and the city gets nothing for that. What we're doing is we're trading certainty, which is an important thing for a developer. You don't get your financing for a development until you know you're going to be approved for your development. So we're going to exchange certainty by allowing the developers to pay a fee. What that fee would be used for would be building future parking. So you're building in the future if we eventually run out of parking or run short of parking in Glendale, which we are quite a ways from doing, but if that were to happen, we'd be building up a fee that would allow us to build parking in the future, or use it for improved transit service and alternatives so that we would reduce demand for parking in the future. The in-lieu fee that we're recommending is roughly equal to the median of the peer cities that we have looked at. We would allow new developments to in lieu up to 50% of their parking requirement. We would also allow, in the case of change of use, for a new use to be able to pay an annual fee. When this occurs, it's usually, for example, a retail store that becomes a restaurant. In the intensification of use, there's a higher demand for parking, and the restaurant owner might want to in lieu those additional parking spaces so that they can meet their requirement. The key thing about an in lieu fee is that it is an alternative way of meeting your parking requirement. It is not a reduction in your parking requirement. We are also offering an opportunity to reduce your parking requirement by offering a menu of demand management programs and proven incentives that reduce parking need. None of these are required. A developer would not have to do it, and if they did do it, there would be the requirement that they provide an annual report, that they track the actual parking demand of their development, but it does provide for some flexibility and improve the financial feasibility of some developments. We would offer a menu of TDM programs and incentives that would reduce requirement. These are all proven techniques that are proven to reduce drive-alone demand and would grant developers a parking reduction based on the breadth and depth of their program. 3 tiers of parking reductions are offered, up to a maximum of 30%. To qualify for these reductions, the development would have to join the Transportation Management Association, would have to provide annual reporting, and would have to be monitored by city staff. And we are also further recommending that the city adopt a bicycle parking ordinance and allow bicycle parking to substitute for up to 10% of required parking by providing additional bike parking in mixed-use development. All of this points to streamlining the process and providing certainty for development. What we're hoping is that we can greatly reduce the need for the discretionary exception-based processes where the city is faced with either granting an exception to a development that it wants to encourage in the downtown, or not to have that development at all. We think that these are sensible changes that will promote the kind of vibrant, active downtown that we are hoping for. But we did make a number of changes since we were here in November, and I want to review those with you. Many of these changes were based on comments that we received from both TPC and Planning Commission on my last visit, and they were supported in large part by, from the business and development community that we met with, as well as council. One of the things we clarified is that there would be a minimum requirement of 1 space per unit in residential development, regardless of the number of discounts and incentives that a developer took advantage of. So in no case could you reduce below a 1-to-1 ratio. We also are recommending maintaining the existing process for shared parking arrangements. We are taking a careful look at shared parking as part of some further study and may come back to you on that, but we are maintaining the existing process. We have recommended eliminating the reduction that we proposed initially based on proximity to transit service. One of the pieces of feedback we got from you was the sense that your transit system is not developed enough yet to provide a discount based on proximity to transit. We hope that by implementing some of these changes, you will be able to further develop your transit service. We've updated our research with new counts. We've recently taken new counts on Brand Boulevard and in parts of the DSP area, and we continue to support these based on new data. And we are involved in an ongoing program of neighborhood protection to ensure that none of these changes would have any impact on the neighborhood. That neighborhood protection program includes the wayfinding program, which will enable people to find the parking garages where they get free parking for the first 90 minutes of parking, as well as making changes to the neighborhood parking permit program, which would make it much easier to establish neighborhood parking permits and provide protection from encroachment from business parking. This is the same example I brought to you last time. I want to point out this shows that in a proposed project with 100 units, 51 bedrooms and 52 bedrooms, the current requirement would be for 187 parking spaces. The requirement under the reductions would be 150 parking spaces. There would be the opportunity to take advantage of other reductions or alternative ways of providing the parking, but the bottom line is that the minimum requirement would be that you provide no less than 100 spaces for 100 units, even with the maximum number of reductions. And again, this would be the minimum example. If the developer felt that the units would not be saleable without additional parking, a developer will build enough parking to sell the development. With that, I am happy to take your questions. If you have questions on the specific code language, I think Mike has a copy of it in his hand. So.
Mr. Chair, one quick question on the last slide. You're considering that guest parking is going to be 0, and based on that is 150.
And
I could be wrong if I do recall we brought up that issue, but again, I could be wrong, to use the 1 per 10 unit, which in this case on 100 units will require 10 parking spaces, and the 150 will be 160.
Mike, I can't recall what actually ended up in the...
So how we responded to that is that the initial base requirements would be 1 parking space per 10 units.
Oh, okay.
Through that, in terms of the absolute minimum, that guest parking requirement can be satisfied through transportation demand management incentives. It could be satisfied through an in-lieu fee, but the absolute minimum is 1 parking space per 1 unit.
But the bottom line answer to your question is you're right, and the slide should have been updated. So we are using 1 to 10.
Commissioner Ford.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Are the in lieu and the reduction features, are those by right to the developer? Can they do either?
In lieu is by right, and the other, I'm sorry, I didn't.
The reduction?
The other reductions, these are by right, yes.
And you have a fee for the reduction. There's no fee for in lieu.
In lieu is a fee. The in lieu is a fee. If you pay, you would pay a fee rather than build those parking spaces, so that is a fee.
Okay. And finally, on the tandem parking for commercial uses, you would allow tandem parking for commercial uses with a requiring a valet.
With a valet.
Is there any consideration given, like when I go to a place and there's a valet, I mean, the prices can be reasonable to, $6, $7 a pop. Is there any thought given to pricing of a valet, any limitation, any?
I don't believe there's a requirement on pricing. Mike, is there anything in the code language on pricing? Is there anything in the code language on pricing of valet services? I don't believe there is. No, there was not.
Is there some, is it realistic or reasonable to maybe consider that? Or, well, yeah, I guess.
Generally speaking, the codes do not, and I'm speaking of the places I'm familiar with, but generally speaking, the codes don't dictate pricing of private parking. So if a developer was going to put in a tandem parking for their development, they would be able to price that service the same way they price what they're going to charge for parking or what they're going to charge for your dinner in the restaurant. Generally speaking, that is not part of the code.
I guess the thinking is the market would determine.
That's right.
Is there any, do you agree with that we shouldn't be dealing with the valet price issue? Is that just too complex?
I think it's too complex because your code exists over a long period of time, regardless of what the market dictates for individual parking. And your code does not limit what a private parking operator can charge for parking. So limiting what a private operator can charge for one kind of parking does not make sense to me.
All right, for now.
Hey, Commissioner Landrigan, you had a question?
Thank you. Ms. Nelson, I do have a question, and it's a tandem question to Mr. Fuentes. When one does have valet parking, typically they take city parking or areas that would be used. Is the city compensated for that? Because when you pull up in front of a restaurant, they usually make it very convenient, whoever is doing it. So they take out city parking spaces or city spaces.
Donna, you want to address that?
Yes, if it's a restaurant, they take a valet permit. If they're using the on-street parking spaces, we charge them a street use permit fee. And then, or if they're parking at the meter, we charge them the meter rate, depending on number of days. And if they're using a city parking structure, we also charge them a fee for that. Sometimes if it's a regular basis, we come up with a standard fee or a flat fee. So there are 50 cars on an average on a weekend, we charge them for that.
Okay, thank you so much. So is that use of those spaces calculated in the parking calculation? Because that is a taking out of spaces that you are then by right. So and a lot of times it's two, because it's like a tandem if they're parallel, or it's one if it's, a diagonal. Is that calculated in the parking reduction, and you have to pay for that or keep that in there as part of that? You understand what I'm saying?
I'm not sure that I do. Let me give it a try.
Give me a try.
If a business wants to have valet parking in a city facility,
right,
they're required to get a permit for that, and they pay for that. That's different than what we're talking about in terms of tandem parking within a private development. If a private developer were to build a building that was going to have restaurant and entertainment venue, for example, and they wanted to have valet parking within their own facility, the current code does not allow them to do that. What the amended code does would allow them to do that, provided that they had a valet that would allow them to do that. They have to provide the parking spaces for that. In other words, they have to have room. If they're going to double stack the parking, they have to have the room to do that. But they have to provide the valet to make that happen.
So my question is, that required parking plus one because of the space that they're taking up for valet?
Yes, they have the number of spaces that would be needed. They have to have the amount of space available that they would need for their valet parking operation. They don't have to have separately accessible parking spaces. So you don't have to be able to operate it without the valet. You have to be able to operate it with the valet.
I understand, but so if I had approval for 24 spaces that I got because I'm going to get valet, but I'm also taking 25 up because I have that pull-in, and even though we're paying for it, so does that mean 24 or 25, or is that not? It's just already taken care of? Because you're taking it out of use.
Anything that comes out of use has to be paid for or accounted for. So if they are taking a space, I think I see what you're saying. If they're taking the space where you arrive at the valet station, and that is now a space that cannot be publicly used,
right,
that has to be accounted for. So they either have to get a valet permit for that, they have to pay for that space in some way.
Okay. All right.
Well, if I may jump, I thought Stephanie was asking, if they're using valet street parking, for instance, using a city facility, a city lot, how does that count against parking requirements? Can they lump that into the parking they're providing? Putting aside the tandem on-site parking.
The use of city facilities for private parking is essentially a shared parking use. And that is done fairly commonly today. There is a process for that. There is a permit process if you're going to have a valet operation, and those processes will not change in this ordinance.
So a spot in a city garage counts as a spot that you otherwise might have to provide?
If the city is providing that space for that development, those arrangements exist. It's essentially a contractual arrangement. It's under the shared parking ordinance that continues without change.
So it does count against required parking on site? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Commissioner Welch had a question.
Yes, staying on the tandem stack thing for a second. In the code language that I reviewed here, it talks about a maximum of 25% of the required off-street parking, but I thought you said 50% up here. So can I get clarification?
Yes, you can.
Yeah, just to clarify, in the code, it's the difference of talking about a concept and talking about it in real, fine-tuned print. So in terms of the residential parking, each unit is assigned, let's say you got a two-bedroom unit, so 50% of those spaces can technically be tandem. So you have one parking spot.
This is referring to non-residential uses, though.
In terms of non-residential use, it's 25%. In terms of the difference of it being, in terms of it being an office use or other types of uses. So only half of the spaces that a non-business use or non-residential use can go for can be tandem. So in terms of that spot that's actually not independently accessible is what you're seeing in the code.
Okay, so it's half of that 50%.
That is correct.
That's why you're putting the 25%.
Right.
Okay.
Right. It's 25% of the total supply, which is
Okay.
Right.
Okay. And the next one, speaking about that one parking space on the residential, I'm not quite clear where in the code language that absolute minimum was required.
Mike, have you got your code handy?
While he's looking that up,
Yes.
let me ask another one. The change of use for the under 5,000, it says for new buildings and structures, uses must be established with a valid zoning certificate for a minimum of 1 year. So the thing that would occur to me is developers gaming the system, running, operating something as a less intense use for 1 year, and then a year later coming back and wanting to, change it to a more intense use just within 1 year of building it. So,
Well, let me answer your first question first because we found it, and these pages are not page numbered. In the section Transportation Demand Management Measures and Point Values, if you look at that table, following that table, it says the following parking reductions shall apply based on the point values from above. However, a minimum of one accessible off-street parking space per residential unit shall be provided.
Okay,
so
good. Very
that's where that is.
Good.
And if you could point me to your second question, I will follow you.
that is section 30.32.030 C2.
30.32.030.
Like the third page of the code documents.
Okay.
Good evening, Commissioners. This ordinance before you incorporates some changes that we've taken to the Planning Commission previously, but they haven't yet been adopted by Council. It's just a little bit of a cumbersome way to write things when we have multiple code amendments going at one time. So in answer to your question, the part about gaming the system, this is, right now, under our change of use rules, even up to 2,000 square feet, we are concerned about somebody coming in, getting, a use, and then combining spaces right away. Doesn't happen very often, but we wanted to put a safeguard in there, which is why we said, the way we do it now is we make someone get what we call a zoning use certificate to establish their business, and people can kind of just do almost fake ones. And so we're saying, okay, you really have to have the use established for a year before you can then combine uses or take advantage of this the second time. So we thought that actually getting a business in there for a whole year, that the year period was long enough to prevent game. You'd have to be pretty desperate to game to actually lose rent or have a fake business for a whole year.
Well, what happens when a developer builds a new building and the space goes unoccupied, but still, the rest of the building is being utilized? Would that count, or does a business actually have to operate in the space to get that zoning use certificate?
A business doesn't actually have to operate in this space. A zoning use certificate can be received. We don't have a way of forcing people to actually go into business when they say they're going to go into business. But again, that's why we put the year period in there to at least prevent intentional gaming.
Okay.
And the Planning Commission saw this in your code amendments. Was it just last week? It seems like so long ago.
Commissioner Yakubian, you had a
Yes, briefly, on the fee recommendations, could you refresh my memory on how you came to the $24,000 in lieu fee and also the $600?
We can go to that, go back a few slides, I can show you. Okay. What you see on this slide are the in lieu fees for selected California cities, including many of your peer cities. We looked at both the range of fees and how they're applied, and we also looked at whether these cities typically build their parking on surface, above ground, or below ground. And the reason that's important is that in Glendale, many of your parking spaces on multi-level garages are underground, and underground parking spaces are very costly. And so while this fee is, about two-thirds of the way up this chart, we feel that because many of your parking spaces are underground, the cost of parking is high enough that you can sustain a one-time fee of $24,000. You aren't going to be getting, every developer isn't going to view this as a great bargain. In fact, that was some of the feedback that we got from developers that said, gee, this fee really needs to be lower in order for me to take advantage of it. But we wanted it to be a substantial fee because we didn't want every developer to think this is such a bargain. Sure, I'll give you $100 if I don't have to build parking, but so that it really would be used by that developer, for example, who to fully meet their parking requirement would have to go down another level. Those parking spaces might cost them $50,000 a space, but they only need to build 10. So they will in lieu that 10 rather than go down that other level. We think we've hit it about right. The code does allow for periodic review of the fee as well as for regular adjustments based on the inflation factor in the engineering record so that it will not be a stagnant fee. That's one of the problems that a number of the peer cities had. They established a fee that could never go up.
And in the future, when would you predict that would be something you would reevaluate or revisit?
Well, the inflation adjustment occurs automatically annually, so it will go up annually, and we would recommend that you take a look at it about every 3 years. 3 years is about as long as a construction cycle lasts, and prices change when the construction cycle changes. Right now, prices are coming in below what engineers' estimates were on many projects as contract is hungry, and so they'll underbid what we anticipate. A few years from now, when the economy is better, we want to be sure that the in lieu fee is high enough so that it still makes sense.
Very good. Thank you.
Commissioner Landrigan had a question.
And in response to that, too, it's my understanding, and please disabuse me if I'm wrong, but that the in lieu fee that you pay $24,000 for a new development, if there is a change of use, it loses that right, and then the $600 annual comes in. Is that correct?
No. A new development, the difference is a new development meaning someone who builds a new building. If you build a new building and you have a number of parking spaces that are required for that building, you can in lieu that demand at the time you build it. The reason we have the $600 fee is, say, for example, you have a retail operation that becomes a restaurant. And the restaurant has a higher parking requirement but cannot meet the parking requirement on site because there's not enough spaces. The spaces were developed for the retail use. They can in lieu the additional parking spaces at $600 per space. That goes with the land use. If that changes and it becomes something else, then the next tenant would have to pay an in lieu fee, would have to start over again.
Okay, because that's what you're saying then, because I read the change of use generally, it says here. And so if that change of use has the similar parking requirement, there's probably not going to be any impact.
Retail to retail, if the use is being met today, it's being met tomorrow, doesn't met, no change.
But if it has an intensification,
Correct.
then they would have to either pay another in lieu fee or have another negotiation with the city, so the city is not, stuck with.
Correct.
Okay, all right, so that's not really clear in the code section, but I think that a change of, it says change of use is intensified here, but I just thought it might be clearer. I have one other question on that, and that is on the change of use exceptions. And I looked very closely at this, and I called poor our planning guru here, Mike, today, and gave him a slew of questions. But one of the questions that I don't think I had answered is, I think that when on change 2, on page 3, change of use, item 2, which is C, number 2, of 32030, taverns, and these dissimilar uses, daycare centers and taverns. In Ireland, maybe. Office, business support, medical dental office, etc. And then it comes down to schools. These seem to me to have a square footage to occupancy ratio that makes sense to me, except for daycare centers and schools. And the only reason I'm saying that is schools run the gamut from being, private schools, private high schools, to colleges, and they have different uses, and daycare centers. And the only reason I'm bringing up a daycare center here is because, to me, I don't think if we put it in here, we're incentivizing it being part of a TDM. Because I really think that if you have a daycare center as part of your transportation demand management plan, then yes, I think it should be in here. But otherwise, I have a question as to those two specifically in these uses.
And is that in the section on the
Change of use.
The change of, but from 2,000 to 5,000?
To 5,000.
Right. Now, you want to answer that? Carry on.
Okay. Addressing the part about, your part about daycare is really well, in my mind,
What?
the point well taken. The schools, though, it says schools of physical training. And those are differentiated in the zoning code's definitions from other kinds of schools. And schools of physical training means an institution or business offering training in physical development and sports, including but not limited to yoga studios, Pilates studios, and martial arts studios. So it's not.
Okay, may I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Remove that comma, because it says schools, comma, physical instruction, and
Okay.
to me, they seem like two different things.
Okay, I'm sure it was done just because that's the way it's listed in our
Okay.
zoning code definitions and other sections
Thank you
of the
for
code.
that clarification. And the daycare one is an issue that I think we should use it as part of the incentive and not throw it in here with bars and nightclubs. My thought.
Yes,
Can I jump in? I'm sorry, I had another question for you, and this was in regard to the transportation demand management portion of this, and going along with what Commissioner Welch was looking at this proposal, sometimes things can be taken advantage of. And I'd like to know what measures there are in place to, I guess, sort of police this. Someone who takes this on, someone who says, great, we're going to do shuttle services, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to take advantage of these maximum point values, they take advantage of it. How do we ensure that that continues to be done and doesn't fall by the wayside?
It's a very good question. They are required to provide an annual report. They are required to document that these programs are still in place, and they would be required to do a survey of all employees or residents, depending on the type of use, to determine what the actual parking demand is. That would be monitored on an annual basis and would be a standard format for that. Because they're also required to be a member of the Transportation Management Association, they would have a role in that. If we found, for example, that a developer said, hey, we're going to provide free transit passes, we're going to do parking cash out, we're going to provide flex time, we're going to do all this stuff, I'm going to put it in our leases, and it's not there, the city has the right to then require the developer to either provide what they said they were going to provide, prove that it works, or meet their parking requirement in some other way.
Besides submitting an annual report, which to me seems like they're kind of self-policing themselves, is there anything being done from the city's point of view? Or would the city be involved in actually, I mean, that seems like a daunting, proposal to do, but is there anything from the city's point of view that they would be more proactive in monitoring?
The requirement would be that the city sign off on that report. It's not just the submission of a report, so the city has the right to do any additional investigation, to make sure that the survey is done according to their specifications, to ask that a report be resubmitted. So there is a role for the city in that as well, and the redress that the city has is that they can require the parking to be required, to be provided, either on-site or off-site, or in lieu, if the TDM is not being implemented as promised.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Kane.
Kind of building on that, within the TMA and for that matter within the annual monitoring, you've already identified there's a cost to the city. So what's the structure, what's the mechanism in place to determine what the costs are for TMA membership, what the costs are for the annual monitoring? How is that put into place? How is it developed?
The TMA establishes their own membership requirements. The city is involved as a partner with the TMA. The TMA establishes their dues requirements. In terms of this impact on city staff, I appreciate the concern, but in evaluating these policies, what we find is that there will be a bit of a trade-off here. City staff will be involved in monitoring these agreements, but they will be much less involved in these discretionary reviews because there will be much less discretionary review. There'll be much less exception requirement, much less analysis from staff in that area. So we do not see a significant increase in staff effort.
I reject that statement. I mean, if your staff already gets paid for discretionary reviews, or they should. Now we're setting up a whole program with X number of parking spaces, with annual reports for X number of properties, and you're saying, oh, don't worry about it, it'll just be absorbed in staff overhead?
Our experience in other places is that the monitoring on this is not significant, that there's a requirement of annual reporting, and that the annual reporting is in a standard format, and that it is a fairly straightforward approval process of those reports.
I might state that it's simply that they are overwhelmed by it and have no way to track it. I mean, we have a hole here that there's going to be a cost. The city's going to be involved, spending staff time to do this, and there's no mechanism to establish what the cost from the monitoring will be or the methodology for establishing those costs. That's a gap in the plan, as far as I'm concerned. Let me ask a couple other questions while I'm at it. So just to clarify, in your report on page 4 where you're talking about proposed reductions in parking minimums, under guest parking you had none or one. The none went away and you're proposing one, correct? Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. In the, it's being suggested some really dramatic differences, basically in some cases 50% of the current requirement. And that is being, your suggestions in that regard are that the established spaces that we had seem to have been arbitrary, and because supposed peer communities have lower rates or lower rates per thousand, we should just match ours to theirs. Is that correct?
Well, there's more than that. We've also done actual occupancy and turnover studies in your downtown in order to determine whether there is, in fact, oversupply. We do believe that there is oversupply, and so we've been able to establish that the requirements are excessive because there is an oversupply of parking today.
Okay, now the oversupply of parking, and we've covered this before, it's also a question, where is the parking? It's an oversupply of parking, but if the need is 6 blocks away, we've got a problem, that the parking is not in the right location for the demand.
I understand what you're saying. I respectfully disagree. Not that I disagree with your premise, but that there is ample parking throughout the downtown. The location of the parking garages throughout downtown makes parking relatively convenient for a whole variety of uses. We do not find that there is any area within the DSP where there is not an oversupply within a block or two of any use.
Okay. I think the only other thing I wanted to clarify, two more things. Tandem parking, 18 feet in length. The idea is to park 2 cars in 18 feet?
36. It's 18 feet per vehicle.
Per vehicle, thank you.
Yes.
Well, it just says here, tandem parking spaces shall have a minimum width of 8.5 feet and a minimum length of 18 feet. It's just defined it as 18 feet in length. I'm sorry? I didn't hear what you said, I'm sorry.
That's a standard parking space dimension in the code.
Right, but they just have defined, again, in the draft ordinance, I'm not sure what page because they're not numbered, but it's on the back side of 30.32A, it's item C, and it says tandem parking spaces, minimum width, and then it has a minimum length of 18 feet.
You'd like it clarified that that's for each vehicle?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, it should be, or 36 feet.
Yes.
Okay?
It absolutely
Basically,
should.
you've created an 18-foot-long tandem space by the ordinance. Under the chart that starts off B, commercial uses, and goes on to the back page, again, without page numbers, I'm guessing where it is, dwelling units in the DSP zone, guest parking for projects, the 4 probably should have been crossed off because it says 4, then 10. And I'm guessing it was just an oversight not to cross off the 4. And this is really petty, and I apologize, but under table 30.32B, projects in the redevelopment areas except partially or entirely located in the zone, it says parking standards, and I don't know if pursuant is a word. I'm guessing it's pursuant, but pursuant may be a word. It's just maybe technical, and I didn't know. I don't know every word in the English
You are
language.
correct. It should be pursuant.
Okay.
That's why we ask you guys to read these things. Thank you.
And I've just proved to everyone I did. So I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Commissioner Fuad.
Yeah, I'll follow on to the monitoring program, and I'm not sure whether this is outside the scope of your project, but we've heard stories that a building will put into a TDM program, and in fact the employees sort of they skirt it. They'll park in the residential neighborhood. Will the monitoring capture actual use by the employees?
What we would require, and you may be referring to Nestle as a notorious example in Glendale, where they have implemented parking cash out, which is generally considered a very effective tool. But the idea behind parking cash out is if you take the cash, it's not to vacate a parking space, it's to not drive. Or to carpool or to use some other means. In the case of Nestle, we've received feedback that isn't working the way it's supposed to. One of the reasons to do the monitoring report is to require a survey of all employees, and this would be a survey that would be conducted an independent survey that could be conducted by the TMA that would identify how the employee got to work on a particular day. If an employee is driving, whether they are parking on site or in the neighborhood, they are driving, and they count as drive alone. So this is actually would provide a layer of enforcement that doesn't exist now in that current arrangement in the Nestle example. And what we would be doing is we would be tracking employees so that in order to count, you would have to have carpooled, bike, walk, or taken transit to work.
Well, and for example, supposing you did identify some abuses by employees that were, driving. What would be the solution if they found that?
The solution would be to say to the employer who is submitting the report, you don't meet your TDM requirements because you are not getting the reduction in parking demand that you need to get in order to continue to get the credit that you've applied for. So you either need to step up your TDM program, you need to change the incentives you're providing. If you don't redress this, then you're going to have to provide the parking.
All done by the free staff time.
We think that there is adequate staff time available for that.
Commissioner Landrigan had a question.
Yes, I do. That actually takes it to the same area that Commissioner Lubian said, which is the penalty for noncompliance, which is, I'm looking at the page that it's on, and it's toward the end of your ordinance. The second to the last page, if you want to go backwards, it's on the front of it, and it says the enforcement here, and it says a nominal fine per employee per day shall be assigned by the city until compliance is achieved. And I just want to caution us that, when the tree ordinance came out and the fine was made and it was not realistic and there was a lot of angst within the city, I think there needs to be a better definition of the fee, and it needs to be really clear to people what they're going to be charged, because otherwise it's very arbitrary and staff imposed, and not that I don't trust staff, but sometimes we forget. I used to be a staff, and I know that sometimes you need to realize that you're there to create the best decision and not be a police person. So I really think that area is very weak. And secondly, on 4, right above it, it says for Tier 2, this is in the tiered areas where we offer these options. We make it really clear where the city is going to bear the cost of it, and I think that bearing the cost on 4, if somebody fails to achieve it, the cost of staff time should be paid for by the employer, whoever it is there. I think we should clearly indicate that people who are not meeting the requirement that they should pay for staff time, and that happens in some other cities, and we can make sure that it's an hourly fee. I would like to just say a few more things, if I may, Mr. Chair. The concern I have with us just dealing with the parking without thinking about it in a bigger picture is that they're going to be the individuals who come in and they're going to go for 25 variances, and they're going to not have to deal with this. So I think there needs to be a real discussion of how many other exceptions to the code there are going to be to benefit from this. And that's not addressed in here. And you all know what I'm saying is sometimes people come in and they've varianced everything to the max we don't know why there's a code. And then they're still getting away without providing parking. So that's not addressed in here, and I'm not telling you how to do it. I'm just saying that's a concern I have. You said 2 things that I find really interesting. I think they also are key to Commissioner Yacobian's concern and mine is, you said there was going to be a survey of residents. Is there a radius that's going to be in? Because I think it's key that a quarter mile, that's what people think they can walk, that there has to be a survey in the TDM of residents that are affected?
That was not what I was, it's not a bad idea, but that's not what I said. What I intended to say, and forgive me if I misspoke, was if it's a residential development, it would be of the residents. If it's a business development, it would be of the employees.
Well, the thing that I don't see addressed here is that if a neighborhood is impacted, how that's recorded so that this TDM is either given a green light and a go-ahead or a yield sign that says, wait, this isn't working. And that isn't included in here. You also, on your slide, said that you had dealt with neighborhood protections. I don't see it in the code anywhere. Where is it?
The neighborhood protections are being dealt with in a couple of ways that are not included in the code. One is we are dealing with the issue of people not being able to find the parking garages or know whether there is parking space available through the new wayfinding program, which will, I think, be very significant for Glendale. I personally, and I've been coming here for the last 6 years, still avoid the parking garages. And I have to ask myself why I do that. And I know where they are now, but it's not knowing how many spaces are available. Is there going to be a space for me if I get there? And so we're going to take care of that with the wayfinding. Not we, Mike's going to take care of that with the wayfinding. The other thing is we are piloting on South Brand, and this will be coming back to you before implementation, some changes to the neighborhood parking permit zone. That will make it much easier to establish neighborhood parking controls and much easier to provide protections of the neighborhood for incursion from local businesses. Finding a good balance between the needs of local businesses and of the residents without having them be overly impacted. That'll be coming to you separately. It's a pilot that we're developing with the South Brand merchants, but we will be putting that in place.
Thank you. And I have one last thing. I'm sorry to... And it's not a typo, sorry. On the very first page of the ordinance, it says the findings, and it makes a reference back to the findings that are made here. And it says on the very first finding, which is A, parking spaces required for the proposed use or construction proposal cannot reasonably be provided in size, configuration, number of spaces, or locations, without impairment of the project's viability. And I called Mr. Nielsen today for two reasons. One is we're making more of this clear so that we know that the city is going to be compensated for some of the things they're not being compensated for, and to make it really clear to individuals so they know what they're getting into when they decide to do development in the city. But there's still an issue of staff making some decisions that seems to be not transparent. And so this finding here seems to me that almost anybody who comes in here and wants a reduction has a self-imposed hardship because they don't want to do it. And what's going to happen on cruise night is what I want to know. Where am I going to park? You're taking half the parking places away. No. And that is a concern, but that's... Are you approaching me?
So for the parking exception process, we're completely taking that off the table for the downtown specific plan area. So
Completely taking it off. There's no appeal process. If somebody doesn't get what they want, they can't. Who are they going to appeal it to? Are they going to go to council still?
the set of incentives that we are moving forward with you guys today is, well, in terms of that will, since we're giving, TDM programs, since we're offering an in lieu fee, we're taking out the administrative exception process for the downtown specific plan area.
If I may, the section you're referring to, those findings, A, B, they are under the paragraph, in redevelopment projects areas not located in the DSP zone. So this will still exist in redevelopment project areas that are not in the DSP. There's some small portion of the central redevelopment project area that's not in the DSP. It's a handful of block faces. It's mostly going to apply to, this is already in the code, and it will continue to apply mostly in the San Fernando Road redevelopment project area.
But on 3032-070, you actually have in a table 30.32B, projects in redevelopment areas except if partially entirely located in the DSP zone. So it's still in that zone.
Let me get to your page, please. Right. This is what you're seeing on the first page of the ordinance. That is a process called the parking exception, which now applies only in redevelopment project areas. And we're taking it out of one of the redevelopment project areas and we're taking it out of the downtown area and making them go through other kinds of processes by which, as Bonnie said, we hope to be able to minimize the arbitrariness and actually get things in return. Does that make sense?
All right.
Okay. So that will continue to apply, but away from downtown.
Okay, just away from downtown, not in the DSP.
Right. Okay, and if I may add one point, one of the very first questions raised was by Commissioner Fuad about whether these parking reductions were by right, and it kind of also goes to your question about how many exceptions are people going to get. So just for the sake of clarity, the minimum parking standards that are proposed for the DSP zone, for instance, where nightclubs go from 28.6 per thousand square feet down to 20, medical office goes from 5 spaces per thousand down to 4, those are by right. But a lot of the stuff in this ordinance is not by right. The city does have discretion. For example, let me thumb through here. Okay. Part about transportation demand management, which is in 3032-070. I want to point out in this chart that this says maximum point values. And I also, in the introductory language above, it says it is subject to the director's discretion, because we know that these sorts of trip reduction measures are not going to apply equally to all kinds of businesses. There's some here for telecommuting. We're not going to allow that for a restaurant. Bicycle parking is going to work much better in an office or maybe even in a grocery store than it is in a banquet hall. So, some of it's by right, a lot of it isn't.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question on Commissioner Landrigan's comment about the applicability here of the exceptions? Why is it the Glendale Redevelopment Agency or the Director of Community Development? And what if they disagree? And what is that process?
No, that distinction is in there because it has some language saying that there is only a maximum amount that can be approved at a staff level, and beyond that it has to go to the agency. I think it's 3 spaces or 5% of the parking requirement, whichever is greater. That's why you see that dual language.
Goosey there, so.
Well, maybe you should say whichever is applicable.
Commissioner Sheets has been waiting very patiently to ask his question. I'd like to call on him now.
What was the question?
You're lucky you can see him.
I apologize. There have been great questions and pretty much touched the thoughts that I had and the concerns, but the one real weak spot in this whole proposal is just a personal bugaboo, but the tandem parking and the stacked parking, I think, is going to be a real issue, just based on what I know today and I've learned over the past 50-plus years in the city. I have concerns in that area. And the one area that I haven't heard enough about to convince me that we're going to take care of it is the encroachment into residential, because it's already there. I don't know how it would be determined if it's going to occur, especially if there's people parking the cars. Are they going to park in the residential or are they not? Are people going to go in their own parking structure or are they not? Where are they going to park? Because our residential is very close to the downtown businesses. And I don't know how, we've had some cases where similar programs like the TDM had requirements that auditing would be done and the audits would be handed into the staff. And when we had the case and discussed the issue at some time in the future with that incident, staff didn't know who was monitoring these audits. And the next level of that for me is who audits these things on a regular basis and what do they do with them? What do they truly do with them? And that goes around the thought of, you had made mention in a couple of your comments about the business, if they did not follow the rules and they didn't meet the management standards, they would be told that they'd have to provide the parking. Now, if I put up an 11-story building and there's not enough parking, how would I provide more parking?
Either through a shared use. For example, the city already enters into agreements with businesses to provide spaces in city-owned facilities at a price. They could do that. They could do shared parking in another facility at a price. They could pay an in lieu fee at a price. So there are financial incentives for the business to continue to have a successful TDM program, or they will have to, if they can't build the parking in the basement of the building, they would have to provide parking by some other means.
I guess, and not to be too, not to point any blame or really make fun of this, but my picture is that to do this management of this process, follow the audits, do the neighborhood protection, follow up on complaints, it's going to take staff. So it's just a thought. It's an area that we need to consider. And one of the weak areas I've seen in enforcement and or communication of rules is that there's, for some reason, the follow-up process is weak. Mm-hmm. And we follow it up, we read the rules, we go to the city attorney, we bring people in, we write letters, and in the end we do nothing. And that's my concern here. This is quite a task.
Well, I don't disagree, and I recognize that it is a burden on staff. The alternative, however, is what you have today, which is you are granting exceptions right now. There's no staff work in monitoring an exception. There's no way to know whether that business is having an impact on the neighborhood, on the surrounding neighborhood at all. And virtually anyone that comes to council for an exception is able to make their case. And the council, if they want that development, is likely to give them that exception. What we're trying to do is to provide a more rigorous process that does involve staff time, but also does involve enough teeth to be able to monitor that use and make sure that adequate parking is provided.
It makes sense to me, and I knew we hadn't had the structure in the past.
Right.
And I understand a good step to try to get there. And the one thing I would add, I do the same thing you do as far as going downtown and not going in the parking structures. And one of the things that got me doing that was I couldn't fit in the parking spaces.
Really?
So there are a number of areas where we allowed reduced size of parking spaces. So if you had anything above medium size or small car.
I'm not going to ask you what you're driving.
No, it wasn't a big car, but it caused people to not go to those places.
Okay.
So there's one group of people that will drive around and park on the street or somewhere else, and there's another group that won't come back. So that's a concern. So that also adds to why I have concerns about stacked and tandem parking. I haven't seen them work. I have real doubt that they're going to work here. But I understand where we're going with the plan.
Okay.
Okay, I believe Commissioner Kane had a question.
Just a quick one. In reading the ordinance, we've heard the testimony that there's a COLA built in to the parking charges. Where is that in the ordinance? I've missed it, but it's page after page, and it's shaded and colored, so I may have overlooked it.
Commissioner King, just to clarify, that would be when the council, should they take action on this, they would adopt a fee resolution
Associated with the ordinance.
Associated with the ordinance. So it wouldn't be in the ordinance, it would be in the fee resolution adopted by council.
And Commissioner Yakubian.
Boy, great questions that are kind of feeding off each other. And to go along with what's been said, and back to Commissioner Kane, again, I have the concern about the TDM, and I understand, I followed what you were saying then, so if they say, hey, we're going to follow these requirements, we're going to get the benefits, we're going to take these points, we're going to do what we're going to do, then they don't do it. The city tells them, well, get up to speed, which I'm not sure if that's going to really work. It might, or they have their other options that you had mentioned. But is there anything that we can do in terms of a fee, in terms of a punitive fee, that we could put in place to kind of give that extra strength when they do enter into that idea of doing the TDM, of taking advantage of that if they don't comply, it's going to be something more than just the city warning them, get up to speed?
It is already in the ordinance language under monitoring, talking about the TDM. Under enforcement, it does say, if a project subject to this ordinance is not in compliance, a nominal fine per employee per day shall be assigned by the city until compliance is achieved. So if you had 500 employees in your business, you were not meeting your TDM requirements, you could be fined based on the number of employees until you are in compliance.
And I'm sorry, that was in which side? That's the monitoring?
It's on Section 7 under D, monitoring. Just the last, it's number E, enforcement, just above Section 8. It's the last sentence in that shaded section. If a project subject to this ordinance is not in compliance, a nominal fee per employee per day shall be assigned by the city until compliance is achieved.
Nominal being non-punitive?
And that would, the amount of the fee, I presume, would be established by, at the time that the council adopts.
And that would be done by
the
council?
ordinance.
Okay,
Right.
very good, thank you.
Commissioner Saab.
One quick question. The independent surveys, they're going to be done by independent contractors. Who's paying for that?
It would be done, in order to take advantage of the TDM, you would have to become a member of the TMA, the Transportation Management Association. That would be part of what your dues are paying for.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Will in residential developments, will landlords be required to provide the spaces to the tenants? Because we hear stories of you build them, but you store boxes in them. Is there something in here that you can have to be actually be made available to the tenant?
It's on a minimum of a 1-to-1 ratio has to be made available to the tenant.
So it's not just billing; it actually has to be made available. There's been a lot of concern here about staff time and costs. I'd ask Mr. McDaniel, do you have any thoughts on staff resources? Is this going to tax you? Do you think you need a little something?
I'm going to just have planning department take care of it. Obviously, there's.
Wait a second.
No, I mean, obviously, as part of the ordinance or changes, we would have to assess and see what impacts it has, depending on what who's going to monitor it. Right now, some of these responsibilities, as it comes to mitigation monitoring, is divided among Public Works, Traffic Transportation, and Planning Departments. So we would have to assess what needs to be monitored, if it's mostly planning projects, and let's say there's a TDM program or surveys that have to be done between the two departments. We would come up with a plan who would follow through and who would do the monitoring. As far as the actual assessment, I don't believe we have done anything at this point to do that. But in general, as Bonnie mentioned, we do a lot right now as part of these variances, and we get involved in doing a lot of shared parking analysis and so on. This kind of a framework, it helps us make it much more easier rather than try to do shared parking studies, et cetera, which makes it more difficult on us, and try to be creative in some areas and be more restrictive in other areas. So that is something we will be assessing as part of this ordinance amendments.
Well, I would suggest as part of the adoption of this ordinance that you maybe actually give some formal thought to this question rather than just saying, we'll see how it goes. And if we determine, if it is determined that there is some staff cost, is there a way of actually, how would you impose the cost? How would you, where would the fee go to reimburse the city?
Well, the fee would be charged, again, without getting into a lot of the details up front, but if there's a fee charge, and if there's additional staff, for the sake of discussions, necessary to do the monitoring, that fee will be established, so then staff will be retained or hired to do that, just that.
But where would the fee be imposed on the developer? At what stage, or how would it be imposed?
As part of the entitlements. As a new project comes in, part of the development entitlements, they would be paying a certain fee to be established, and that fee will be captured through our financials, and then we will then be, let's say, if we don't have adequate staff to deal with it, then we have to retain staff. We will deal with it accordingly at that point.
Now, and do these regulations, these changes, do they only apply to new projects? What's the retroactivity? How does it work?
Basically, defer
How's
to
it phased in?
him, or if you want to address it. New projects obviously will, new projects that are coming in, we will be, once City Council approves it, they will be subject to these parking standard changes.
Let's supposing an existing office building, developed business doesn't comply with the TM, it doesn't comply with the traffic management. We're going to have this monitoring. Is this going to be imposed on existing businesses?
No.
This is for new developments only. The current, you're regulated by the regulations that were in place at the time you received your entitlement. So new developments would be subject to the new ordinance. Old developments, businesses that are already in place, would be subject to the ordinances that were in place at the time they were entitled.
What about change of use?
Exactly.
For new uses, if you have, for example, you have a retail store. Let's say the Borders bookstore, for example, which I was very sad to see is going on. A new retail use goes into the Borders bookstore. The retail parking requirements would be as in the new code. If if they wanted to go with if they wanted to in lieu some spaces, or they wanted to make some changes, they would be under the new code. So it's new buildings, new uses are under the new code. Existing businesses, existing facilities are under the code that they had at the time they were entitled.
And I have just one final comment suggestion. As these reports come in, and I guess it'll be fairly small if it's only for new projects and change of uses, I would encourage Public Works to maybe make regular reports to the Planning and the Transportation Commission, maybe on an annual basis, somebody to let us know how it is functioning.
And I also wanted to provide one small bit of reassurance, perhaps to Commissioner Kane and others who are concerned about staff time, which I do appreciate. The only developers or businesses that would be filing TDM reports would be those who tried to take advantage of the TDM provisions in the code. So if you build a building and you provide the parking, the minimum parking requirements, whether you provide it by providing parking on site, providing parking by shared use, providing parking by in lieu fee, you're done. You don't need to provide an annual report. The only businesses that would be providing annual reports would be businesses that took a reduction in their parking demand based on providing a transportation demand management program. It's those that would have to be monitored. Anyone who met their requirements, regardless of how they met them, would not be required to do annual reporting in the same way that no one is required to do annual reporting today once you've met your requirement.
And if you met your requirements via tandem parking, what side does that fall on?
That's not TDM. If you met it via tandem parking, so long as you continue to provide the parking, and the city has the right to monitor that as they do today, so long as you provided it and continue to provide it, you would not have to provide annual reporting. That's only if you received a reduction in requirement.
Let's see. Who was next here? I'm not sure where to go to. Let's go to Commissioner Kane. Then
I had
Commissioner
nothing.
I'm sorry.
It was an auction. I moved my hand. I have nothing.
But even then, there needs to be some type of monitoring. And I do recall I worked for an employer where I received independent surveys asking me, did you telecommute? They had a bunch of questions. And if you need somehow to monitor that they are meeting the TDM requirements.
Yes.
So again, even in that case, there will be some type of monitoring. And I think what you're hearing is that the program should generate by itself enough funding for that one position or half position or the overtime needed to do monitoring, basically.
I absolutely agree, and I hope that Mr. Bogdanian was able to reassure you that the fees related to staff time can be built into the permitting, the occupancy permits and the other permits that the developer has to receive in order to build their development, that if there is an additional cost, that can be captured and it can be generated through fees.
Okay, are there any more questions? He asked tentatively.
This has been a great discussion, and we've really benefited a lot from it. I appreciate it very much.
Well, maybe just one more thing. You've seen this used elsewhere in other cities.
Absolutely.
And you can tell us it's worked.
Yes, you are not the first. You will not be the last. It is working. In fact, what is recommended for Glendale is not at the extreme end. I do live in the Bay Area. I work in the city of San Francisco, a city that has no minimum parking requirements. You are not required to build one parking space. We had a 1 million square foot shopping mall go in the Bloomingdale San Francisco Center, not one parking space. We had a baseball stadium go in, no parking dedicated to that, and development going in on the surface lots there. I would in no way have recommended those requirements for the city of Glendale. I want to make that clear. So we are not taking you from 0 to 100. We are taking you from, pretty progressive to a little bit more progressive in ways that address the desires of the DSP. They're relatively modest changes, but they're changes that I think will help the vibrancy of your downtown.
Mr. Chair, can I throw one more thing in here?
Please.
Thank you. You took out the transit-located reduction because I think we had a good point, and thank you for doing that. But we also discussed that much of the vibrancy is really going to be dependent on our transit upping its frequency and also its convenience, because if a person wants to go someplace and they don't have their car, there's a limited amount of time they have at lunch, et cetera. So that is still an issue. And as part of the mobility study, that's a very key element. And we haven't addressed that here. Is that going to be addressed?
Well, it's addressed to the extent that we will have, we now have priced parking on Brand Boulevard. When we started this venture, the parking was free, and whether you like it or not, that generates revenue that can ultimately be used to provide more transit service. By accumulating in lieu fee, you have the opportunity to either build parking or to use it for other things, including transit service. In order to get the vibrant transit service that we all so much desire, you have to have a funding source. And what we're doing here is putting in place the opportunity to capture some of that value that's now being essentially given away in order to create that vibrant transit service, which I certainly hope is the outcome.
Well, is there a way to say that a percentage of it should be actually reserved for that? And to me, that seems to be more proactive than just saying that it's one of the, options A, B, C, or D to use.
Right.
If you say that a percentage of it should be used for that and reserved for it, then you guarantee that transit is a priority and not lost in the shuffle.
Well, the establishment of the transit, the downtown transportation fee, the establishment of this when it is adopted by the council, the uses of that, including the potential to set aside for transit, is something that Mr. Bogdanian has been talking about for some time, would be determined by council. But I think everybody agrees that the use of these funds to improve the vibrancy of your transit service is critical.
Okay, any other questions? Wow, we're done. Okay, and I don't have any cards submitted for the item. I guess I can open and close the public hearing. And who would like to start the discussion? Any volunteers? Okay, Mr. Sheets, you're on the block here.
Even though it might sound like it, I'm not opposed to the plan. I think we're going in the right direction. I've been here long enough to know that in this city to know that we've got some terrible problems, and what we're doing now isn't going to solve them. It's hard for my small brain to get around the idea that cut back on parking available, it's going to be a good thing, but I do understand the concept. I hope we get there. I don't have any additional input. I think we're going the right direction, and I think we asked some really good questions. Help clear up some issues that I had. Need to move onward and upward.
I also feel like we're moving in the right direction, and to use words used previously, I like the fact that this is going to be developing a regularized, is that the right way? I'm not pronouncing it right, process with a realistic code for the city of Glendale, which, and I think the big thing for me is that we're finally maximizing, as you say, the benefits to the city, which went which we did not see previously, maximizing the benefits to the city and also to the citizens. So I think we're in the right direction. I had the concerns about the TDM, I don't know, people will try to find loopholes. I just hope that, that as we're doing this and crafting this, we can put such measures into place that would discourage such things. But that's my comment.
I also think we had enough discussions and we're moving in the right direction. I personally like to see a sunset clause in any ordinance which gives you the chance to reevaluate and then reactivate the ordinance. But in this case, I don't see it's needed. I do absolutely agree that enforcement is very important, and without enforcing it, you're going nowhere. It's going to help us out. It's going to help out the Planning Commission. Hopefully, you're not going to deal with exceptions left and right and variances. So I'm ready to move it.
I'm perfectly happy to move it forward. I have still a couple of issues in terms of the monitoring on the those who get these by rights reductions, for in lieu fees or tandem, and that there's no requirement for them to have any kind of monitoring on that. I would prefer that there was some kind of monitoring or reporting on that as well. And that the 1 year issue, it still concerns me a little bit that it's based off of the zoning use certificate. I'd rather it be based off of when a business first goes into a space, that they occupy it for a year. But, I mean, it's not that big of an issue for me to oppose this, so I'm certainly willing to put it forward. So.
I echo my colleagues' comments, and I'm ready to move forward on the ordinance as well.
I have a few observations. I'm a commercial contractor by trade, so anything that involves building and creating more work downtown, obviously I'm going to my pocketbook is going to favor it, but there's a big part of me that kind of checks that hat when I come through the door. And there's a couple parts of this that I think it's a good document, but it has flaws. Because no document's perfect, but there are flaws. And a fellow commissioner has already noted concern over the monitoring. There is no teeth in that. It will be abused. It will not be followed through. It will be a problem. And directly related to that, the biggest issue I have is there's no protection for adjacent neighborhoods. I mean, if this was a moat and it was just the downtown specific plan and anybody that lived in that was affected by it, so be it, But the facts are it will fill out in the neighborhoods. There's no mechanism to protect them. I note that finding A, where it says parking places for the proposed use or construction proposal cannot be reasonably provided without impairment of the project's viability, there is not a single developer in this world that can't make the statement that, if I have to provide a parking space, it'll ruin the project's viability. This should be called, instead of item A, this should be called the wink, wink, nudge, nudge finding. Because it's just, of course, the sky is blue type of finding. The other thing that worries me about this is I think we're opening the door for a period of frankly, chaos, without the protections for the neighborhoods, without all the other things that are going in place, without the monitoring. I mean, and I appreciate the candor of the consultant when she stated that even she, who testified that we have more than ample parking in our parking structures, refuses to use the parking structures and seeks out street parking. It tells us that we all need to change our attitudes. And we're about to enter a period of chaos because our attitudes are going to be very slow in changing, especially with the lack of transit infrastructure that we have. So I will join in on a recommendation that City Council take it up, but it's with the idea that City Council will help to address what I perceive as some of the flaws. Thank you.
I've been particularly impressed by the proposal and the presentation that we've been given, and I've learned a lot from today's discussion as well. A lot of good points have been brought up. Obviously, there are concerns about the monitoring of this. I do also have concerns over the enforcement, the actual enforcement of the districts that may be created as far as parking requirements on the streets outside of or streets. The new enforcement created by the requirements created by neighborhood associations for their street parking, and this enforcement, the new enforcement from our parking or police or parking enforcement going into making sure those requirements are actually being applied. I know I have talked to a number of residents who have said that a lot of the new charges and usage fees on brand are making a lot of people park on their streets now, even though there might not be required to park on their streets. This is particularly on Louise Street, because some parts of that require a permit, and they say that there is a lack of enforcement that goes into that. So I hope as we move forward on this, we do a better job of enforcing the type of permits and people parking on those types of streets, as well as doing a better job of the monitoring of this type of policy that we're, excuse me, the policy we're moving forward on. But everything else, I am just fully supportive of the change that we're about to go forward on in Glendale.
Thank you. I, too, am in support of this ordinance. I do want to reiterate the concerns that I have, and some of them are a duplication of my fellow commissioners. One is the enforcement section needs to really be clarified, strengthened, and an appeal process put in there. I think it needs to be really clear to whoever comes in here what the consequences of not meeting the TDM will be, and so that that's in place. And an appeal process is not mentioned anywhere in here. It has to be addressed. I also think that we don't have included in here the fact that this does not typically come as a standalone request. It comes along as a package of other discretionary applications, and we need to address how it is put in that full package, how when you come in with a selection of variances or a CUP or use variance and this, how it is really going to impact in the long run the city's intent of having a zoning code to bring about community. Third, I want to reiterate, I think the neighborhood protections really aren't clearly in place. That's just an issue that's not in here. I would like to encourage the council to reserve a portion of the in lieu fees for improving transit and creating the vibrant community that this is supposed to support, and would really work in tandem with the reductions. And lastly, I'd like to say again that I think daycare in that list of uses is sticks out like a sore thumb, and that I think it also discourages individuals from providing daycare as part of a package, which then provides on-site daycare use, where you really do reduce parking because the person who comes in has their child with them. They aren't driving all over town at the same time. There's care there. They can interact with the child, and they can leave at the same time. So that seems to me to be sort of contrary to some of the intents. Other than those items, I really think it's a great leap forward for Glendale, and I think it's going to help us a whole lot in bringing about some good development.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'll start off by saying that I think one of the things you've heard tonight is some skepticism regarding the efficacy of enforcement, not only for transportation demand management, but for perhaps for some other issues, like one I can think of offhand is the mitigations for mitigated negative declarations. We have, I think, the skepticism that you're hearing is well-founded, and it is well-founded because of the experiences that we've all had in encountering either people that are trying to game the system or take advantage of in particular, a lack of enforcement. Again, feel that's needs to be a very important part of this. I would also agree with the idea that a percentage should be earmarked to fund transit. The Planning Commission members present may not be aware of this, but our commission has been dealing with, over the last several years, line-by-line analysis of the B-line system, and we are looking at reductions in service rather than additions in service. Due to the current budgetary climate, this is exactly the opposite direction we need to be moving in if we're going to really be able to support this. So I think that's an important component. Again, several of my colleagues have mentioned that your number one area of concern listed in the staff report is the potential for spillover parking in adjoining residential neighborhoods. And I think at least when this goes to the City Council with our recommendation, it should also come with a recommendation that maybe they should be taking a look at that area as well. And other than that, I'm in support of this, and I think I agree somewhat with Commissioner Kane's prediction that there may be some chaos from this. Hopefully it'll be a low level of chaos rather than a high level of chaos. Yeah, change always comes with some difficulties and readjustments, and I don't think this is going to be any different. Hopefully we'll be able to minimize it. And with that, do I hear a motion from the Transportation and Parking Commission?
I move to approve with the understanding that all the concerns that the commissioners have are part of the package that's going to go to the council.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. We have a roll call.
Commissioner Fwad?
Yes.
Haken?
Yes.
Yakubian?
Yes.
Commissioner Welch?
Yes.
Chairperson Wiseman?
Yes.
Could we have a motion from a member of the Planning Commission, please?
I move that we accept the plan and have it move forward with all of the comments, move forward to the council.
Second.
Motion support call roll, please.
Commissioner Landrigan?
Aye.
Commissioner Lee? Commissioner Sheets?
Aye.
Yasayan?
Yes.
Chairperson Kane?
Aye.
Thank you. And what is next, please?
Item 4 is Commission staff comments updates.
Anybody interested in updating us on anything? Staff, commissioners?
I do have one quick question, Mr. Chair. I wanted to know if staff has looked into the electronic meters, not the pay stations, the electronic meters.
Yes, we're currently working with a couple vendors to test some of these electronic vendors, the individual meters.
The individual, basically
Yes.
their cell phones.
Yes. we're looking into that right now. We're doing some evaluation.
You're ahead.
All right. Any other comments or updates?
Make a quick comment if I could.
Please.
I was very impressed with the consultant in all of the meetings we had. Very thorough, very complete, made everything, a lot of clarity around what they were presenting. I think the main comment that I heard that key to me is putting a process, a system, a structure in place today. Don't have one now, so I think that's critical. She made that clear to me in all of the presentations, so reiterate that. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And I would add to that as well, staff and Nelson Nygaard, I think, have done a pretty amazing job on this. It's a complex issue, and there's a lot of competing interests that need to be paid attention to, and I appreciate the attention to detail. And with that, do I hear a motion to adjourn? We are adjourned.